Well, greetings to you and welcome to this session that is systemic change at the district level. And I see a lot of friends here. And so I'm excited about this conversation that we're going to have. My name is Jaron Rao. I serve as president at Nazarene Theological Seminary. Prior to that was a district superintendent, like some who are in this room. So very interested in this particular conversation. It's my privilege to introduce to us our presenter for this session. Sarah Akutagawa is a national director for diversity for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship USA, where she leads organizational system policy change in the areas of diversity and inclusion. She's originally from San Francisco, was raised in the Chinese Church of the Nazarene before attending UC Berkeley. By the way, Sarah, I just sent a note to them, to that congregation, because they just a few weeks ago sent a beautiful gift here to NTS, so had a chance.
Oh, really? Oh, I know Auntie Nancy's on here. Hi, Auntie Nancy.
So Sarah has worked in full-time campus ministry for 10 years, focusing on planting new ministries and overseeing international student chapters. She lives now in Santa Cruz and is pursuing her Masters of Divinity degree from Fuller, and also a certificate in strategic diversity and inclusion management from Georgetown. So you just need like one more thing to do.
That's right.
Sarah, we're honored to have you with us, and let me just turn it over to you as you guide us in this session.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody, it's nice to meet you. I'm gonna share my screen so that everybody can see my PowerPoint. Is this big enough for all of you to be able to see? I'm going to also make sure that everyone can see me, everyone can see the picture. If you want to be able to see me and the picture, you can go ahead and click up to the grid view, and that way you can kind of move the bar and see both the presentation as well as my face, which not much to see there. Okay, great. So because we're a little bit shorter on time, I am going to move a little bit faster so that we can have more time for Q&A. I believe that this is one of the smaller groups, and so one of the benefits of that in my mind is that we can get more time for dialogue, and so I will go quickly, and I hope that if there are things that bring up questions for you or there are things that you're curious about, you can take notes and can actually have a time to talk about them. A little bit about me, so thank you so much for the introduction. I think you said mostly everything I was going to say, but in this picture, at least I wanted to show you, this is my family. So that's Kota, he's the one I'm holding. He's 2.5-ish, and that's my husband, John, and we moved here to Santa Cruz for his PhD program. And the picture behind me is the picture of the church that I grew up in, the Chinese Church of the Nazarene in San Francisco. Because I grew up in San Francisco, I didn't have a yard, front or back. But my neighbor had a tree, so that is probably the closest thing to like foliage that I grew up around. But when I moved to Santa Cruz, the house that we moved into had a huge yard in the front and a huge yard in the back. And one of the things that I was so excited about in moving outside of kind of a dense urban center was a chance to be able to landscape and plant plants and grow herbs and really live that kind of farm to table kind of life in Santa Cruz. However, what they teach you in school is that if you put a seed in the ground and it is watered, and scripture, I think in Mark 5 also says, you know, you just plant things and then the earth waters it, you go to sleep and it grows, you know not how. And so I imagine that planting a garden would be just like that. The one on the left is what my garden looks like as of yesterday. So this is my garden. You can't see, but I actually made a garden bed, and now it has been completely overrun by nature. Now, at first I thought it was just because that's just what Santa Cruz is like, but actually the garden that you see on the right is my neighbor's. That's Janelle's garden. She has a sunflower growing in it. We go by, we pick mint. My son goes by and picks flowers that he smells. This is what I imagined I could have, but the picture on the left is what I was able to produce. The reason why I say this is because when we recognize the elements of the ecosystem that impact the kind of work we are doing with soil and with planting and with harvesting, that actually tells us a lot more about the fruit that we will receive. So when we pay attention to the ecosystem, that will actually tell us a lot more about what we can expect from the fruit. So what I learned is that there are things like, you know, you shouldn't just plant things in sand. You actually need nutritious soil. And many of you have gardens that I'm sure look more like Janelle's, and you're like rolling your eyes. But for those of you who grew up in the city, you're like, what? certain soil has different nutrients, and it does. So, right, shade and sun, and how often you should water, and where you should plant things in relation to shade and sun, what kind of insects are bad and good, and what you need to be watchful for. Like Janelle, I see her plucking off snails, and I'm like, you're supposed to go back to your garden and like look for that. And that's why her garden looks the way that it does. It is the attentiveness to the system, the ecosystem, that enables a garden to grow. And so when we're going to talk about systemic change, for many of you at the district level, or for those of you who are not in the Nazarene denomination at kind of a more systemic or organizational level, this is what we're talking about. That when we're looking at racial justice and racial equity, we are talking about looking at a community in the larger context of the ecosystem that it lives in. So we're going to be asking questions about resources, like where are water and sun being spent, right? We're asking questions about the inherent assumptions of the community. Like, what are the nutrients that are in the soil already? Does that kind of make sense? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic change. And I think that requires a willingness to look at the issues that we see today, not just on their own, but to realize that they are fruit of a larger system that we don't always see and that we don't always talk about. Now, it's interesting to me because I think so much of the way that the church has talked about racism has been very personalized. It's very much, I've heard a lot of books that are very popular right now are about kind of recognizing the ways that you might be a racist. You as an individual, that's kind of the racism journey. Or at best, it becomes more just like an interpersonal thing. Oh, I have done something racist to you, and so therefore I need forgiveness from you. And that is true. There's personal ownership, there's interpersonal harm, but actually I think it lives on a much higher level as well. And I don't think that's too strange for many of us who are Christians here in this room, because we know that when we think about the gospel narrative, it's the same thing of our sin is not just personal. It is not just this one thing that I have done, I am a sinner. There's also this interpersonal harm that happens when we sin. And we also know that it takes on this cosmic and more global thing as well, which we see in war, which we see in disparities among nations, which we see in kind of environmental injustice as well. It is personal, it is interpersonal, and it is systemic. And the flip side of that is that the good news of Jesus, the resurrection power of Jesus, is also able to kind of penetrate to the personal, to the interpersonal, and to the systemic. So the hope that we have going into this webinar is that as racism may be this thing that impacts us both on the personal, interpersonal, and system level, so is the hope that we have in the gospel to be able to bring healing and transformation and justice at every single level. There is no place that racism and sin can go that the hope and the resurrection of Jesus cannot. So here are my goals for our time. And I said, I'm going to go fast. So I am talking very quickly. I hope y'all are able to kind of follow with me, but I want to leave time for questions. Here are the 3 questions that I'm hoping to cover. And I will probably cut a few things. And if you have questions, you can get my email address so we can talk more later. But here are the 3 things that I'd like us to talk about. Why is system thinking important? How do systems perpetuate racial justice or injustice? And what can you do to be a part of systemic change in your district? So for those of you who have ever been to a missions training before, oftentimes they'll try to explain to you what culture is. Raise your hand if you know that culture exists. Culture is real. It's a phenomenon. Yeah. So most of the time when people are explaining to you what culture is, they'll use a picture of an iceberg. They'll say, okay, there's behaviors over the waterline. It's what you can see. But underneath that, there are some values and some beliefs. And underneath that, at kind of the bottom of the iceberg that you cannot see because it is so deep under the waterline, are these worldviews. I don't know if any of you have kind of been taught that, but I know that when I was doing cross-cultural missions, this was how they were explaining to us that what you see on the surface is not the whole person. It comes from this larger kind of culture that they carry. And so when we think about organizations and system change, it's actually very similar. What I would say is that for an organization, you have an event or something you can see about a community that is above the waterline, but you also have beneath that certain trends, patterns, assumptions, and norms that create kind of the culture of a community or a system. This is true of every district in the Church of the Nazarene. There are things you can see about your churches, about your pastors and your congregations, But underneath that, there are patterns, histories, and assumptions that live beneath the waterline. Now, one of the biggest barriers that I get in my work with InterVarsity as I talk about systems thing is that a lot of people because we are rooted in kind of an American cultural system, will always say, well, sure, there's a system, but I'm an individual. And the thing that I hear the most from so many of the staff that I work with is that because I'm an individual, the only thing that matters is my merit, my intention, not my impact. See, individualism tells the world that actually these rules and barriers that you say are there, they don't apply to me. I see that they're applying to other people, but I don't really see how that impacts me. Individualism sees problems in the system as external. That's somebody else's problem, and they don't actually see how they may be involved or complicit in it. And the thing that I just want to start off to say is that individualism is one of the tenets of white culture. And if it is hard for you to hear that you are white or that you have a culture, I absolutely recommend that you do some reading to understand that there might be other lenses with which to understand something like a system that you might be living in. So I want to name that that's one of the barriers that I come up against, and want to challenge you that if you're coming into this and you're thinking, I may belong to a system, but what really matters is what I do as an individual, my invitation for you is to come and to be able to hear possibly things that might be beneath the waterline, things that you may not be able to see, but that together, hopefully, we can get a better sense of. And we see this actually in Scripture. So I'm assuming that most of you all know the story of Acts 6. So I won't run through it to kind of save us some time. But in Acts 6, when the Hellenists are complaining against the Hebrews because their widows are being overlooked, this is not seen as just a personal problem. They do not say, oh, well, widows, you may be hungry, but you really should just trust God more. This is not an interpersonal problem where they get the two widow groups together and say, work it out and pray. This is actually a system level issue in which the entire community of the disciples are brought together, and a leadership team of Hellenists, the people who are most marginalized then in this church community, are appointed, including Stephen, the first martyr. And it is an entire church system action to say this problem is not just personal, it is not just interpersonal, it is revealing that there is something broken and dysfunctional in our system, in this church system, that we need to be able to respond to. The system is broken, and yet it is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and there's something wrong. So while it can be uncomfortable and very vulnerable to say, what do you mean there's something wrong with my system? What do you mean there's something that I don't quite know that I need to change? My invitation for each of you spiritually is just to say this, that I think thinking about system change is a chance for the Spirit of God to reveal who are we really? And what is our system designed to do? Who is our system designed to benefit? And who is our system harming? And those questions can feel really scary to ask, but I think the courage that we get to have is that it is God actually who gets to come in to reveal and to illuminate those things so that there can be healing and justice. This is not for the sake of judgment and condemnation, but is really so that the Spirit of God can move in a new way. Don't we want that kind of transparency and that kind of honesty before God in our leadership? So when I think about the kind of difference that it can make to even be thinking about systems change. So before I was doing my work with InterVarsity as a diversity director, like Jaren said, I mostly worked with international students. I did a lot of Chinese American faith development programs. But when the position for the National Director of Diversity opened up, I was back from maternity leave for exactly 4 days. I had an infant. I was learning how to juggle being a full-time worker plus a mom, and I was not looking for a career change. When the vice president approached me to apply for this job, I was honored by the invitation, but I did not think I was qualified, and I did not think I would have capacity as a new mom. The day before the application was due, the vice president called me, and he said a lot of things, but one thing he said that I really remember was he said, "Did you know that most men will apply for a job even if they don't feel 100% sure that they're qualified? But women will almost always apply for a job if they are sure they're going to get it. They will not apply if they are not sure that they're going to get the job." what he was doing was revealing the system to me a little, right? He was lowering the waterline to help me understand the norms and assumptions that are there in terms of gender. And when he did that, and he lowered the waterline a little bit so I could see the system that I was swimming in, I was actually empowered to apply. I applied, I got the job, and I've been doing it now for about 2 years. I do a lot of consulting for Christian churches and organizations, and one thing that I'm learning that I want to speak to all of you is that the work of inclusion and justice is about making the most impactful change at the right level so that diversity and difference is leveraged for the sake of mission. I'll say that again. In district leadership, your job is to figure out what are the most impactful changes you can make at the right level, personal, interpersonal, and system, so that diversity and difference is leveraged for the sake of mission. So examples of personal things that we can be thinking about would be, what are the resources that are going to help us understand modes of prayer, evangelism, mentorship, and leadership that do not only look like one kind of people? On a personal discipleship level, how are we teaching people about their own differences so that they see that it's actually an integral part of their discipleship? If the very first time that a person realizes that their skin color is a good thing is when they go to college and they learn about this in an ethnic studies class, there's a huge loss there. But how different would it be if there was a Sunday school teacher who named for a child that your ethnicity and your race was an intentional and good part of how God has made you and will use you in this world? What if, when somebody is confronted with their privilege or confronted with an act of discrimination because of the color of their skin, that the church has actually prepared them to be able to respond, that those aren't just categories that are seen as irrelevant to faith? These are personal things that I think need to happen at the personal level. But the interpersonal is just as important. How are we helping our congregations have difficult conversations together? How are we instructing groups to do your own work and not just require marginalized people to do all of the educating? How are we teaching groups to talk about and enact forgiveness without dismissing ongoing trauma and pain that still happens even if you forgive? Do our churches know how to listen to different voices together? Do our churches know how to lament together? But most of you are here because we're thinking about the systems level. And so here are 3 things that I want to bring about district leadership. The first one is about the base level of theological understanding that we expect of our pastors around ethnic identity, justice, and global/American history. I did a consultation for a mega church 2 months ago. This church has been around for 150 years. They have 7,000 to 10,000 people based on the week. They have over 100 staff. And when George Floyd was murdered, the discipleship pastor called me repeatedly on the phone. She was super anxious, and she said, "Sarah, we need a book list for why biblical justice is found in Scripture. Like, we need a book list to tell people why racial justice matters to the gospel." If your church has to outsource on this topic, I just want to say that racism isn't going away. This isn't like a hot 2020 topic. This is actually something that you're going to need to be thinking about in a sustained way. This cannot just be a specialty topic. The church as it is right now is already decades behind. And the way that I know that is because if Ben & Jerry's, an ice cream company, has on their website kind of naming white supremacy and how it is being worked out in this country, and they are working on business practices to reverse that and work towards racial justice. If an ice cream company is doing that, but a mega church scrambles to create a book list, there's something wrong. The church has had access to a God who claims to be for liberating the oppressed since the beginning of time. The church has known that God cares about freeing the bonds of those who are held back. And for us to be able to come into this moment and say, we can't come up with a book list, for an entire staff team of pastors to not be able to do that, to me is a huge disservice to the congregation. So at a district level, what are the things that we expect of our pastors? Is it new information that they're starting to learn about race, or is this something that has already been built into the things that they're expected to learn? The second thing I would say at a systems level is to think about diverse hiring slates for your leadership positions. So thinking very intentionally about any open pastoral positions and doing your recruitment with shrewdness and intentionality. That doesn't mean that you skew how you hire. That doesn't mean that you change the qualifications, but intentionality around who knows about the job being available is very important. And the final thing I would just say is transparency and accountability around diversity goals. That district leadership, I would hope, would think about how each pastor has designed and is planning to implement a 3 to 5 year plan on diversity and inclusion within their congregation. And I know that every district works very differently. I'm very unfamiliar with the whole system of the Church of the Nazarene now, but why, in my mind, I would love to see leadership be able to say that we can and hope for some kind of accountability in this area. I have a quick rubric that I'll just share, and you can just take a screenshot, or maybe this will be available later. But I tried to create a very simple rubric on how systems can create either perpetuate injustice or pursue justice. And here's what I would say. For systems to perpetuate racial injustice, this is typically what I see. That in order for people to belong to the community, they must assimilate to a cultural norm. 2, that historical and current realities of injustice are often labeled as political topics rather than pastoral opportunities. 3, resources and models of ministry will see whiteness or maleness as the norm. And 4, that leadership will seek little to no feedback from voices that are different from them. But there is the reverse of how can a system pursue racial justice, and it is that a people can belong to a community because their differences are celebrated and leveraged toward the mission of God, where multiple experiences are integrated into the congregation's theological praxis, where resources and models of ministry are drawn from many perspectives that may not be typically dominant, and that leadership actively seeks input from different voices. And this is where I'll close. For you personally, when I think about the opportunities that you may have in your district leadership position to make systemic change, here's what I think you can start even with today. The first one is that you can start by embodying the type of leadership that you want to see around you. So regardless of kind of how genius your strategy may be and how excellent your team may be that you form around you, if you yourself are not trying to embody curiosity, humility, a willingness to make mistakes, if you are not letting your own mind and spirit and family be shaped by voices that are different from you, it will not be a sustained change. Reflection on norms. One thing that I would say starting today is begin to look at the system that produced you. What rules and norms and resources did you benefit from? Name them. How did these rules, norms, and resources affect people who were different from you? How much of your leadership is trying to maintain the status quo, and how much room do you make for intervening where there are places of inequality and injustice? Data. I would really consider every district leader to think about the data of the cities and the communities that they serve, and to think about how congregations and clergy are reflecting the demographics there. In terms of input, like I said, with any ecosystem, it is impossible to know the system only from your point of view. There are a lot of things you cannot see. For example, do you know what the different pastoral needs are for pastors of color? What kind of education do you need to do for yourself to provide better servant leadership for the different people that are in your district? And finally, to get feedback regularly and receive it humbly. So as you're trying different interventions on a systemic level, state your intent to your people and say, how did I do? Like, was this the impact? Did I impact this system the way that I had hoped to? Then learn from it and try again. Just saying, well, I'm trying my best and walking away without getting any feedback and without learning is not enough. So to conclude and to leave some room for Q&A, I just want to say this. I'll just leave this picture up. So I work for InterVarsity, and we've been talking about racial justice and racial inequality for a very long time. We're not perfect. We have a long way to go. But if you look at our executive board, our national leadership, and our regional leadership, it actually has mostly, there are a lot of people of color. It's about 60 to 70% people of color and a lot of women. And many times people will come to me as the diversity director and they will say, where did you find these people? Like, where did you find all of these? I'll stop sharing actually. Where did you find all of these people of color? Where did you find all these women? And I will tell them, actually, most of them are homegrown. They've been in InterVarsity 15, 20, 30 years. They started as a freshman that we found in the dorms. They became leaders. They joined staff. We developed them and they became managers. We promoted them and they applied for regional positions. They grew and are now our national leaders, our executive vice presidents, and our president. And so what I would say to a lot of people is that what we're looking at in InterVarsity's leadership right now is a reflection of the values that InterVarsity had 30 years ago. And so when you think about the Church of the Nazarene and what you want it to look like in 20 and 30 years, it really is the decisions that you will make today, the systems that you will change, and the way the ecosystem will be made to become a more just, equitable, and diverse community that will be able to pave that path for the kind of community that you hope is leading this denomination in the future. Oh, I can't believe I got through all of that in like 25 minutes. I wanted to leave some room for Q&A. And so, Jaren, if you want to go ahead and lead that. I know we only have 6 minutes, but I would also love to offer myself to anybody on this call if there's anything that you want to talk about in the future.
Thank you, Sarah. God bless you. This has been really helpful. So, yeah, I think we've got some, let me try to get in a couple of the questions that have come through. One of them just very practical, and this may be actually a question that others could respond to even in the chat, but are there templates for developing a district resource tool, a booklet, set of resources, systems management, accountability? Any knowledge of what other maybe district entities or those similar entities have done to begin to curate resources in this regard? I'm
not sure about district level, since again, I'm pretty outside of and unfamiliar with the structure of the Nazarene denomination, but I do know that Brenda Salter McNeil has a book on Racial Reconciliation 2.0, which is really around how churches can kind of think more structurally about the pathway that they take towards addressing the issue. I do think that it's really new to think about how we're going to do this, not just in a personal and interpersonal way. So even for the work that I'm doing with InterVarsity, it feels very new to think about how are we thinking top down to create a more just and equitable organization, since mostly this has been a very bottom up. It starts with a lot of personal stuff, a lot of interpersonal. But as with most things, we all know that normally these kind of smaller interpersonal conflicts reveal that there's this larger systemic thing. And it's really not a very common thing in a lot of evangelical spaces to have a format or even, like you said, a template to think about system change.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I wish there was, yeah.
And by the way, I did put a link in the chat to place on the seminary website where a lot of resources have been gathered in terms of books and videos and things that have come together from seminary faculty and others, just gathering lots of different resources in this regard. But particularly to what you're talking about there, you reflected on this a good bit, but I'm just wondering if I could poke around a little more on, as a leader, what would you do in a particular context to learn more about what is below the waterline? What are some of those particular leadership activities? That's a
great question. I think it really has to start with self-education. So I think for the most part, what I've seen a lot of people do when they want to understand what's below the waterline is they set up these focus groups where they will bring all the people of color into a room and they will just say, tell me about what I don't know. And they'll learn something. Normally it'll be actually a very tearful, I think, heartbreaking experience. When you see what's below the waterline, it's a very humbling thing. But what I would really encourage people to do is the biggest and I think most beneficial leadership move that you can make is to understand your own role in the system. Like I said, one of these questions of asking what about the system produced you, right? So if you are in a position of leadership, the best thing that I think you can do as a leader is to understand what were the norms and assumptions that were actually to your benefit. And that doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't make you somebody that you don't need to be embarrassed. You don't need to hide that. But if you do not acknowledge that, then when you have these conversations with people who are different from you, you are not actually coming in fully aware of the work that you need to do internally. You're actually requiring other people to do that education for you. However, if you're able to come and say, you know, over the past 3 years, I have been reading books about white privilege, about male privilege. I've been praying about who mentored me. And I realized that in my class of interns, no woman intern pastor ever had a mentor who was at a higher level than this. But I had immediate access to those men. And I realized I got promoted much faster. I realized that I had far more of a relational network telling me where there were openings that I could apply to, inviting me to conferences. those are part of the system that has formed many of the people who are on this call. And I think a really huge leadership step is to learn how to acknowledge that, to name that, and to ask the Lord, how am I supposed to steward the system that I'm living in? So that would be one big piece. And then I would say, yes, it's really important to listen. Then I think after you've done that internal work to educate yourself, find the people, like Sungchanra was saying, find the people who can mentor you and walk through this path with you and go a little bit ahead of you to say, and to give you honest feedback of, I know you meant to say it this way, but this is how you're impacting me and my community. And if you don't have people like that, I think you need to probably take more time to think about the system, because it might be that they don't trust you to fully see what's below the waterline.
Yeah, really good. We'll see if we can sneak in one more.
Sure.
Someone in our group
later.
Someone in our group notes that we tend to rely in our system on relationship knowledge within our system, people that we know.
Yeah.
And so leadership hires and invitations to, leadership on boards and things gets to be about typically who we know.
Yeah.
So trying to think about how do we expand that? How do we change a system that tends to rely on familiarity into more of a disciplined system of looking around and saying, who's not here and how do we get them here?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's great. And InterVarsity struggles a lot with that too, because I think most churches and Christian orgs don't see anything wrong with things being about relationship first. But what we don't realize is that our relationships themselves are very much formed by the system that we're living in. And so we tend to then replicate beneath us the things that built us up. That means that we end up just kind of replicating ourselves. And so I think to be able to have a community conversation about what do we really want to see about who we are in 5 years and 10 years does mean that it will become a little bit more uncomfortable. It won't just be the person you mentored who's going to take your role as a pastor. It does mean being more intentional about seeking out new relationships and maybe questioning why you don't have relationships with certain people to begin with. Why do you fit with certain people and they're your friends, they're just your buddies, they're just the people that you're discipling, but there is a system that has formed that, and it is often because they are people who look like you or think like you.
Yeah. I would note for us, one of the places where that seems to happen is at district assembly, where it's an assembly that elects a district advisory board, for example. And so I would just note to my district superintendent friends who were here a number of years ago in the Kansas City district, and it looks like we're moving. So we'll talk later.
That's fine. It was so nice to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.